The Grim Drive podcast explores mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. Pro athletes come forward more and more with stories about their mental health journey, what they have endured, and how they managed to push through, reflecting a mental health stigma that continues to be reduced. Pro athletes also leverage mindset to achieve peak performance, as well as representing and often driving elements of popular culture through the use of social media, technology, and personal branding. This places athletes front and center as role models for people of all ages, giving them a platform to reach many and deliver important information, including information about mental health. Welcome to the Grim Drive podcast, where we explore mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. Today we're going to be delving into identity and profession. And so I think for this particular episode, we're going to focus on an article by Rod Benson. Rod Benson is a columnist for the SFGate. I think that's a San Francisco paper. He's a fine artist and also a former professional basketball player for the NBA D-League and the Korean Basketball League. He's previously written for Yahoo Sports and Slam Magazine and is a graduate of UC Berkeley. So Rod Benson, I read a couple of his articles. He's really good.
Mm-hmm.
I actually want to reach out to him. I'm sure he won't get back to us because nobody does, but that's okay. Everyone's busy. But I really like the way he writes because I feel like he's got the former player angle, but he really understands the mental health angle. I mean, I think from his personal perspective maybe, but also just in general, like as a clinician, I think you hear him write and you're like, oh, this guy gets it. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Which is really cool because that's not always the case, nor should we expect it to always be the case, as we've talked about with members of the sports media, whether it's fair for us to put expectations on them to really grasp the mental health side.
Yep.
So he did an article called Don't Clown Kyrie Irving's Mental Health Days. I wish I'd done the same during my pro hoops career. So we talked about Kyrie Irving in the last episode. If anyone wants to go check out the episode that we did previously on interviews and fan behavior, we talked about Kyrie Irving and how we're not sure he's the best spokesperson for the mental health day movement in pro sports. But so Rod Benson wrote this article about Kyrie Irving, really about just mental health days in general, wishing he had taken them. And he talks about his career and he reflects on some other players. And he says, quote, "There are two aspects of mental health in sports that are still under discussed. One is how retired athletes adjust to life after pro sports, and how too many current athletes only connect their mental health to their performance and nothing else." We have talked about both those things in a lot of depth in different episodes because they definitely were coming up as themes over and over again. Mm-hmm. This also relates to LaMarcus Aldridge, who recently retired and opened up about his struggles to accept that because I think he had signed with the Nets. They're going on a run now. He had to retire for physical reasons, I think. Mm-hmm. And now I think he's dealing with some mental health things in terms of missing out and adjustment and that kind of stuff. So we're talking about identity and profession and why it's risky in general to tie identity to one thing, whether that's profession or otherwise, because it leaves you vulnerable in case that thing is taken away. And it's interesting because I want to touch on one thing that he said, John, and then kick it to you to get your thoughts on this, because he talked about why with sports it almost even goes beyond that, because you may have to change who you are too, which was I've never seen it written this way, and it really stood out. And he wrote that about James Wiseman and what it would take for him to find success in the NBA. James Wiseman's a rookie for the Golden State Warriors, second pick in the draft this past year. He detailed, Rod Benson actually detailed how Rod Benson, had to literally alter his personality and become a different person entirely to achieve his fullest basketball potential. And he says, quote, "What I didn't really get into was how crazy that process actually was. I didn't just become a different person. I became more violent and less vulnerable. I kicked it wherever my teammates wanted to hang out, often in strip clubs in those D-League days, even if they weren't the types of places that I enjoyed. There are so many ways one can go from looking the part to just being the part." And so it brings up this interesting point about how people have to chameleon to their job or workplace culture at times to their detriment. It's not just in sports. I think this is an extreme example. I think it happens for other people too. So what do you think about that, like in terms of the chameleon process of having to do this, kind of change who you are?
Yeah, we've talked about this in other episodes too, about what brings you fortune or what brings you whatever it is you think you need in that moment isn't necessarily always what you need long term, right? So for athletics, we've talked about this a lot, that like a lot of athletes see emotion as vulnerability, and any type of vulnerability is a weakness, right? And can't show any of those different things. And aggression, right? Like being overly aggressive or being more aggressive, or those are both sort of seen as, positive qualities, whether you agree or not. We've talked about that beforehand. And you sort of do have to, you hear athletes talk about this, like they embody this new person of who they are. But what we know as clinicians is that when you are believing yourself to be something different than what you actually feel who you are, there's massive, like the word is dissonance or like disagreement within your head.
Yep.
And that over a prolonged period of time is really difficult. And then for the retirement piece, when you leave the game, now you're in like a state of crisis. You've lost all your support. You've lost your performance where you were feeling like successful. You've all of this stuff coming crumbling down. And then you're left with that like, well, who am I? Right. Because like to your point, all of your sense of self has been tied to your performance and your ability to do that. And you've learned that requires me to be aggressive and not be vulnerable. And so then when you leave, those are the things you've become, and you try to incorporate your daily life or your new life with those qualities. It's problematic because those don't translate well to real life outside of the sport.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of other people listening who aren't NBA basketball players who can relate to some of the stuff he's saying with regard to like when you work at a certain place, there is an element of like having to adapt and chameleon yourself to the workplace culture of the people there in a way that may not be, I think the jargony term would be egosyntonic, right? That where it's like it's not in line with who you are and your personality and your beliefs or your values or your interests. It's entirely necessary just so that you keep your job or you're able to succeed and support yourself.
Right.
But it really isn't in line with who you want to be or are. And I think that's what he's talking about. I think a lot of people have that struggle in a workplace where it's like, I think of like, especially, I'm trying to think of what we see the most. Like, we work with a lot of young guys. So I've worked with quite a few young guys who are like very much emotionally intelligent and emotionally available, but not, aggressive alpha males in a good way, right? That's a compliment. And when they're around, if they're athletes and they're around these sports teams, which tend to have a lot of like self-conscious, male, aggressive, like don't show weakness kind of style athletes, they struggle sometimes because it's like they get caught in this like, do I have to like be fake and change who I am? And what's the cost benefit analysis of that? And that is a bit of a mind, what? I mean, where it brings them through this process of feeling like they have to fake it in a certain way to survive in that environment. And sometimes I think they almost kind of do from a sports perspective. It's really hard to just not adapt a little bit to that because that isn't the environment you're in. I don't know. What do you think about that? I'm rambling a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And I think that the thing that happens is that sometimes if you embody something that isn't you for long enough, it becomes you, right? Because you continue to do that. And I think that happens a lot, and especially in like work environments or team environments, there's a lot of like groupthink that goes into it. Like if you feel like you're outside of what the common belief is, you feel isolated. You don't want to feel isolated, and so you incorporate. There's a famous experiment that and for psychology, I'm sure you've heard of it beforehand, but there was an entire class, entire lecture of like I think like 200 or 300 people. I might be getting the numbers wrong, and everybody in the class was in on it except for one person. And a professor basically said, "Okay, here are 3 lines. One of them is different than the other one, and which one is it?" And basically went through the entire class, and everybody said one line was shorter than the other one when clearly it wasn't. And it came time for that one person who didn't know, and they agreed with the rest of the class versus what they were actually looking at. And I think that happens a lot. And if you continue to be in an environment where you kind of forget about yourself and continue to embody what you think is appropriate, it becomes really problematic because you are what you practice and what you constantly feed yourself in your head. And I think to this point, I think that's why it is really hard for athletes to transition out of it, because I think they do embody, especially in male athletics, this like masculine, egotistical type of mindset. And then when they leave, it's really hard to shake that because they've been practicing it for, I think, how long was he in the league for? Like 17 years or something like that? Like a long time.
And he had to go to multiple cultures. I mean, he played overseas, so it's like that's a whole different ballgame.
Right, exactly. So it's definitely it's a huge topic, and I think that a lot of athletes who I highly recommend, anyone really, can relate to a lot of things that he's saying in that article.
Yeah, and then it's interesting because it almost like these types of things can happen very slowly. I mean, we see this with people where it's like. I don't know what the psychological term is, but the effect we've talked about where like if you gain a bunch of weight and you look in the mirror every day, you're not going to notice it necessarily. Whereas someone who hasn't seen you in a few weeks or a couple months especially is going to spot that out right away because they don't have the benefit of seeing you spaced out. When you're so close to the painting, right? We use that analogy a lot. You don't often see these challenges or these changes happening, especially negative ones, we have this, our body and minds have this amazing ability to adapt to even the worst circumstances. And while it's great for survival, it can be very negative for thriving after that because of the lasting effects. And this kind of like relates to, he sort of mentioned, almost like alluding to an added layer of trauma to what it is to be a professional athlete, which I had also never really considered before. I mean, he even mentions like his arms and wrists are littered with scars from pesky guards trying to steal the ball from him and then drawing blood. The psychological mind games of competition that he had to go through for years and years and years. And he mentioned, quote, if mental health issues that arise after retirement are the symptom, it's the rigors of competition that are the cause. And he even references, I mean, I got to give him bonus points for this because anytime someone references Shawshank, I think I actually referenced it in the last episode. I love that movie. So he mentions Morgan Freeman's character is being so acclimated to prison life that when he's released, being on the outside just doesn't feel normal. I love that comparison. I mean, it's a horrible comparison, but like I love it in terms of the accuracy because it really captures like just the trauma that maybe an athlete has to go through for all these years of competition. And then to have the rug pulled out, it's like, where am I? It's like you just came out of jail after 30 years. Culture is different, all that kind of stuff. Yep.
And you've lost, he speaks about this a lot, like your support system. He talks about it in two different ways, which I appreciated. Like one is that you lose that support system, right? Like you lose the trainers, the coaches, the access to team, the access to connection. You lose a lot of that when you are out. And he also talks about it, which I really appreciated, that he says that oftentimes it asks us sort of like a mask. Yeah. Like it sort of masks mental health issues that someone might be going through because they're given a lot of like support. And this is definitely something, if you've ever been injured as an athlete, you probably can relate to, that when you don't have your sport anymore, all that stuff that the sport was probably helping to support or to either distract you from or not address or mask, right, comes to the surface. And I think that that's a really great point. And so it draws the question of, are we supporting athletes the way that they need to be supported, right? And are we actually giving them what they need? And based on this article and lots of other reporting from other athletes as well, the answer is no. Yeah. And I think that there's a lot of things that we can be doing to help shift that for athletes especially.
For sure. And I mean, I'm glad you brought that up because that he does mention how that support system is key, but not enough. Like you need some professional help with people that understand how to work around these areas, and you need to be proactive. Right. And this gets into this subject of like, you know, how being proactive with mental health, being proactive with mindfulness is so key, and yet rarely does it happen, right? And he actually draws parallels in terms of like, you know, the American healthcare system really not encouraging preventative medicine. And we've talked about that. The mental health space is no different. It's very hard to sell people on prevention. They often just wait until problems are clear-cut and have been forming for lots of time, right? We talked about how slow these problems develop and how it's hard to see them coming from a mile away, even though they've been gradually forming all along. Right. The healthcare system is very much like that, where it's just like, it's all about react after things have gotten way past the point where you should have been like intervening. And he talks about how, I think he mentions Jason Gant, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, a sports mindfulness coach, believing that athletes rarely take measures to improve their own mental health. And at times, he says, preventative mental health is seen as a joke. Many top athletes have an if it ain't broke, don't fix it mentality. So this is I'm fascinated by this topic, and I don't know the solution, and so I don't expect you to, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts because you've worked with so many athletes on like, how do you get an athlete? I mean, I can draw parallels to our work with young guys where like young guys come in, think they know everything, and when they're entitled, I've often told parents, entitlement is much harder. It's probably the hardest issue I see in terms of turning it around. Harder than depression, harder than anxiety, harder than substance use. It is entitlement, because the level of denial and just not seeing what's actually there is so blatant that they cannot, the distance from where they are to where you need them to be is so far. And there's such a massive wall between that. It's very hard to get changes because they are seeing a whole different set of variables than what is really happening. Right. That's what entitlement does. And it almost seems like this is the athlete version of that. When they are so used to being at the top of their game and being great at sports and getting paid a ton of money, it leads to them really not being able to see or being completely far away from being able to see these problems that are forming and being able to consider like, you might not have this in 3 years or 5 years or 7 years. And when you don't, what's that going to look like? Right. I think this is almost like athlete version of entitlement. It's like they can't grasp. Someone comes to them as like, hey, in 4 years, you might be out of the league and struggling. They'll be like, yeah, I'm not even going to entertain that idea. I actually think like entertaining that idea to them is viewed as weakness, probably. And so they refuse. They'll just laugh it off. He even says stories about that. how do we handle that? Like, how do you get through an athlete or person that's that far away from believing?
Yeah, so I think a few things. I think it's definitely still seen as a joke for a lot of times. I think some of the stuff that initially helps is that some of the most successful both coaches and players utilize these skills. So I kind of use humor when I'm getting up against that of just like, okay, so Tom Brady does this, Brad Marchand does this, Kobe Bryant did this, LeBron does this. So like, okay, great, you don't want to, so why are you better than them? Right, and that usually breaks it up a little bit of them being like, "Oh yeah, you get back and forth," like because the answer is you're not, or else you'd be in the NBA or playing professional. So I think that's one way that I can sort of draw that as sort of to generalize it of like this is no longer, and I've said this quote before, but I think it rings so true. Sarah Lazar, who's a neuroscientist out of Harvard, used this quote in one of her research articles. It says, mindfulness work is no longer a nice to have, it's a must have. And I couldn't agree with her more. And I think one thing that happens when we introduce mindfulness, I think I could go on this for a long, long period of time, that I think that the trendiness of mindfulness has an unintended consequences, oh, it's trendy to be mindful. It's a detriment. Yeah. I think it's sort of like people dismiss it, right? Yeah. And I think also it because of the trendiness of it, I think that while the intention for teams to incorporate it is beneficial, it feels like it's just like a checkbox because they're like supposed to do it. Mindfulness is not about like just it's a state of mind. It's a state of being, right? It's not something that's just like, okay, we did it, let's do it. It's mindfulness is all about like this is something that's just a lifestyle, like something that you're incorporating in everything that you do, not just like, okay, we did yoga for 20 minutes, we're good. Yeah. And I think that's part of the reason. I think for athletes who are already pretty hyper scheduled and do a lot of different things, to be added of like, okay, now and I think he talks about like the 5 a.m. yoga where they basically just like slept and he like got excused because he was laughing at it or something like that. I think that's probably a pretty common thing for most teams where like, I think again the intention for coaches is to like let's bring this to our athletes. I think the way that it's rolled out is incorrect in it being like we're going to do mindfulness now. It's like it needs to be explained of like this is a state of mind and a perspective we want you to try to adopt and incorporate into just like your everything that you do, not just like for 20 minutes a day. That might be what the practice looks like, but the overall goal would be that this is something that's going to influence you, everything that you do. So that's one thing that I feel like would need to be shifted. And in terms of like the buy-in, I definitely think there's more to be done. I think people are trying to shift that a lot. My approach is always, humor. And like I said, drawing on examples of people who are doing the work, who attribute much of their success to that work. Phil Jackson, old coach for the Lakers, brought on the guru of like sports mindfulness, Mumford. Yeah, George Mumford, who came and did a lot of work, and that's why Phil got his nickname the Zen Master, was because he brought George on to do the work. Yeah. And all the guys that worked with him would attribute a lot of their success to like that style of work. So again, it's like, why are you better than Jordan or Kobe or Shaq or any of these guys that do this? What is it about you that makes it better that you don't need to do this? And I think once you have that initial conversation of like calling out that, whether it's entitlement, I do see that a lot of like, I'm good, I don't need this or whatever. I don't see the need for it right now. Pushing it down a little bit is a good approach, but I think with athletes, it's dangerous because they're so focused on like what's happening right now that they don't even allow themselves to think about what could happen in a different way, because for them, I think it's seen as weakness, and two, I think it's so terrifying for them to entertain the idea that there is a life outside of this that they won't even go there. Yeah. And so while it's sort of one of these dances you have to do of like, let's entertain the idea of what retirement looks like, right? The average range of like professional sports, like time frame that people have to play professional sports is not like a 20, 30, 40 year career. It's not that. Football, I think it's like 5 to 7 years. I think it's something like minuscule in terms of like your long-term life. That's not a long period of time. So I think there's a lot of things that go into that. I think, like I said, drawing on other people that do the work. I think I do I'm a big brain nerd, and so I can like show actual pictures of brain development, of what changes and what areas of the brain shift and change when you do consistent practice, and how those areas of the brain will influence your play in a positive role. There's lots of ways that you can add buy-in, and then sort of systematically challenging either the ego or the entitlement, I think is a good way for them to buy in. And it usually works pretty well.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, I think that once you disarm them with so Kobe did it, and Jordan did it, and so what do you think about that? And once you get them there, then I think it's like, okay, let's just, so you know that you're not too good for it. What do you stand to gain by being in such denial that you can't entertain this idea? And that will help disarm them, because it's about, like you said, fear, right? If I open my mind up to this, it means I'm considering that I'm not perfect or that my career might end. And if I consider that I'm not perfect and my career might end, I will instantly be less confident. I won't be sharp enough to succeed. And you got to disarm that. Because
that's an issue, right? Because if you're not confident enough to sit with that idea, that's a problem, right? And that's an actual hindrance and a barrier to you being able to perform well now if you can't think about that.
Correct. So it's like a black and white kind of thing with them, where it's like, how do you acknowledge that would be a bad thing, while also saying that just because you're considering the benefits of mindfulness doesn't mean you have to then be weak in the next game. And then, being able to separate those two things to see the value in both without looking at it in very black and white terms. I think people tend to look at things in very black and white terms because it's easier to make sense of it. Very binary in terms of the way the human brain works. You also mentioned George Mumford, and I think that speaks to, I mean, obviously he's a master with this. It speaks to a couple things. I mean, I think the buy-in needed from the coaches and the whole organization, it really needs to be authentic, all right, first. And two, you have to have one or ideally more, right? You had Phil Jackson and George Mumford. You have to have more than one person capable of eliciting buy-in and being able to navigate the groupthink mentality. Because amongst guys especially, a lot of it's about fear of embarrassment. If I'm the first to admit that I'm buying into what a George Mumford is saying, what are the rest of these guys going to think about me, or how are they going to treat me? I think a lot of times, if you don't get the right people in place, a lot of athletes are going to fear embarrassment, and that fear of embarrassment or losing their edge amongst their peers is going to come above their actual thoughts on the subject. The thoughts might be like, no, I kind of like what he's saying, but my fear is up here about what happens if I acknowledge that publicly in front of these people. Right?
Yep, exactly. And one thing that you touched on before, and that reminded me of it. One thing that Tim Ferriss actually does this. We've talked about this before, and he does an exercise called fear setting. And one thing, part of that process, basically, is sort of like put all your fears down. You talked about how you can prepare for them, and talk about how to react if they happen. It's a really sort of like a systematic way of addressing fears in a sort of a safer way. And one part of that exercise that I use a lot. So I might not necessarily go through the full fear setting exercise, but one thing that I almost always do is he calls it the cost of inaction. And I usually will do this pretty consistently. So, okay, you're telling me you don't need this. Let's talk about 2 years from now. What does it look like if you don't address these things that are clearly plaguing you? What happens 3 years from now, 4 years now, 5 now? What happens if you do nothing? Yeah. And if you get people to unlock that way of how not addressing these things now could potentially lead to things later on where you're going to end up having to come back in here anyway and do the work. Why not get a handle on it now and build skills now when you are in a better mindset versus trying to work through some things when you're feeling low and down. It's really, really difficult to do that. And it's really, and for people who suffer from depression and suffer from anxiety, you ask them, if you're in that type of headspace and someone's trying to help process with you and walk you through different things, it's almost impossible. You want to be, the best work comes from when you're feeling pretty good. It's way easier. And you can actually engage in the work rather than have to work through the feelings and emotions that are hindering you from even getting to that point, which is why preventative work is always the best approach. But it's a lot of it is especially with guys of not broke, don't fix it, or I don't need the help because I'm strong enough. It's all this bullshit that we have to sift through that just is all it's doing is just it's increasing your weakness, right? It's just contributing to that.
Well, it's totally ego, like you mentioned
earlier.
All ego. It's all ego.
Right. Yeah, because I'm above this. Right. I'm above this. I don't need it.
Yep. Yeah, it's that false sense of security. I have to lie to myself and be in denial and tell myself I don't need this to maintain the charade that I'm perfect, that I'm powerful, or whatever. And in reality, we've talked about this so many times, right? The other form of strength, the healthier, more intelligent form of strength, in my opinion, is to show the vulnerability needed to admit, I'm no different than Jordan or Kobe. I need that too. If I don't now, I'm going to, so I might as well start, right? I agree with you. I think preventative work is so much easier to see success with, so much harder to get the first step. That's where it's difficult. But I think if you get the right people involved, they're able to get people over that first hurdle.
I agree.
So that's the end for today. We're going to put some links, obviously, to the Rod Benson article in the show notes. We'll also add maybe some links to George Mumford, books, and also the Tim Ferriss.
Mindful Athletes, the book he wrote. Highly recommend.
Great book. And then we'll also add links to like the Tim Ferriss fear setting thing so people can see that, because I definitely agree that's a great thing for anyone to use. We use that all the time in our work.
Yep.
So I want to thank everyone for listening to the Grim Drive podcast for this discussion about identity and profession. We'll be back next week with a new episode.
Thanks, everyone.